There is an old management concept called pour encourager les autres. It is French. It comes from Voltaire, who was describing an actual execution, the British Navy shooting one of its own admirals to encourage the remaining admirals to try a bit harder in future. The phrase has become a gentle euphemism for something that is not especially gentle. You make an example of someone not because the example particularly deserves it, but because you want everyone watching to understand what happens to people who disappoint you. I mention this not because I'm a fan of executing admirals, but because it describes with uncomfortable precision what just happened in the Indiana Republican primary elections. And calling it anything else requires a fairly determined effort to look away from what is obviously in front of you. The version of this story you are most likely to have encountered goes something like this. Trump told Indiana Republicans to redraw their congressional map. They refused. Trump threatened primaries. Primaries happened. Trump won. The MAGA movement is very strong, etc. That is a factually accurate summary, in the same way that describing a chess game as moving pieces around a board is factually accurate, technically correct, missing almost everything. Because the Indiana story is not really about redistricting. It is about something considerably more interesting and considerably more uncomfortable, depending on your political priors. It is about what happens when a sitting president of the United States, in his second term, decides to spend $10 million targeting members of his own party in state-level primary races that would normally be decided by a few hundred politically engaged retirees. And whether what happened next was a demonstration of democratic accountability or something that requires a different word entirely. Let us establish what actually occurred starting in December 2025, because the framing of this story depends enormously on which part of it you choose to start from. The Indiana Senate voted 31-19 to reject a congressional redistricting bill. Of the 40 Republican senators in the chamber, Indiana's Senate has 40 Republicans and 10 Democrats, which gives you a sense of how dominant the party is in that state. 21 Republicans voted no. Now, the ones who voted no did not do it secretly or without explanation. Senator Spencer Deary, who represents West Lafayette, said on the floor, "My opposition to mid-cycle gerrymandering is not in contrast to my conservative principles. My opposition is driven by them. The power to draw election maps is a sacred responsibility directly tied to the integrity of our elections and the people's faith in our constitutional system." Senate President Pro Tem Roderick Bray, who led the opposition, put it more bluntly. "Many of my caucus members don't think redrawing our congressional map mid-cycle is a guaranteed way for Indiana, or our country, to achieve that outcome." Senator Dan Dernulk, who voted no, received a bomb threat to his home the night before the vote. He voted no anyway. I mention that detail not to be dramatic, but because it is relevant context for evaluating what kind of pressure these people were under, and what they decided to do in spite of it. The spending figures are where this story becomes genuinely unusual. Presidential allies spent, depending on which estimate you use, somewhere between $8.3 million and $10 million on these state Senate primaries. To put that in context, most state Senate primaries in America are decided by local name recognition, yard signs, and whoever shows up to the county Republican dinner. They are not normally the kind of race that attracts eight-figure spending from Washington. Senator Jim Banks ran his own super PAC, Hoosier Leadership for America, which spent $5.2 million. A second PAC, American Leadership PAC, spent another $3.8 million. Club for Growth Action spent $2 million across 8 races. Turning Point Action deployed field representatives from around the country to run ground operations. The incumbent senators did not have equivalent resources. Senator Travis Holdman, one of the incumbents who lost, faced more than $1.3 million in attack advertising funded by banks and Governor Braun alone. Holdman had spent a combined $142,000 on both his 2022 primary and general election. He was not built for this kind of fight. Not many state senators are. Holdman's statement after his loss is, I think, the most illuminating thing anyone said during this entire episode. He said, "I did what my constituents asked me to do, and it cost me my job, but that's okay." And then he added, "Welcome to DC politics in Indiana, because this means that's what's coming." You can interpret that in various ways. The most charitable is that Holdman is acknowledging a new political reality without bitterness, which, if true, suggests a degree of personal dignity, not especially common in people who have just lost their jobs. The less charitable interpretation is that it is a warning to every other state-level Republican in the country about what the rules have now changed to. Both readings are probably correct. What is notable is what he did not say. He did not say he voted the wrong way. He did not apologize. He did not suggest his constituents had been misled. He said he did what they asked, and he lost. Which is, of course, exactly the kind of outcome that makes the whole exercise difficult to evaluate cleanly. Here is what I think is genuinely interesting about Indiana, and it is not the part that most coverage has focused on. The conventional story is, Trump strong, senators weak, loyalty enforced, lesson delivered. That story is not wrong as far as it goes. But the more structurally important story is about what kind of political party is capable of directing $10 million at its own members in a state where it holds 80% of the Senate seats, over a vote where the official position of its own Senate leadership was that redistricting was not strategically wise. Because what that tells you is not just that Trump has power within the Republican Party, which has been obvious for a decade. What it tells you is that the party's internal accountability mechanisms now run from Washington outward rather than from constituencies inward. The senators who voted no said they were responding to their constituents. Roderick Bray said his office was contacted 10-1 against redistricting. Washington decided those constituents were wrong, and Washington had $10 million and a president to make that point. One of the challengers who won, Blake Fichter, a Bluffton City Council member before this campaign, said something worth noting when asked what had motivated voters. He said seeing what Democratic states were doing in redistricting had, and I am quoting, really amped up support for the Indiana effort, which suggests, with some delicacy, that the argument which finally moved voters was not that their local senators were wrong on the merits, but that the other side was doing something similar, which is perhaps the most honest account of how this decision actually got made. As I record this, Indiana was not the end of the story. 2 weeks after the Indiana primaries, Thomas Massie, the Kentucky congressman who had, with some consistency, voted against Trump's priorities on the grounds that his principles were his principles, lost his own primary to Ed Galrine, a former Navy SEAL whom Trump had personally recruited for the race. The Kentucky contest became, according to multiple reports, the most expensive House primary in American history. More than $32 million spent on advertising. Galrine won with approximately 54% of the vote. Massie, in his concession speech, said, "What happened today was God's will, and we have to figure out what was the purpose of having the biggest fight ever. And then, we're just getting started." Which is, depending on your perspective, either admirable defiance or a deeply unrealistic assessment of what just happened to him. I am not entirely sure which. Massie had, it should be said, voted with his party the vast majority of the time. The issues that got him targeted were specific. He opposed military action in Iran. He sponsored legislation releasing the Epstein files. He voted against the big beautiful bill over debt concerns. Trump called him the worst and a total disaster. The voters, at least in the primary, agreed. At some point in covering any political development, you have to confront the question of what category it belongs to. The Indiana primaries combined with the Kentucky result present a categorization problem that is worth sitting with rather than resolving too quickly. On one reading, what happened is straightforwardly Democratic. Republican primary voters chose candidates they preferred. They were presented with options and they made a choice. Nobody was prevented from voting. The incumbents lost fair elections. That is how primaries are supposed to work. On another reading, what happened is that a sitting president coordinated a multi-million-dollar national campaign to punish state legislators who used their own judgment rather than following his instructions, in a manner more reminiscent of how a political machine manages dissent than how a constitutional republic is supposed to process disagreement. Both readings are available. I am not going to tell you which one is right, partly because I think reasonable people can land in different places, and partly because the most important thing I can do here is give you the actual information and let you make that call yourself. What I will say is this: Travis Holdman's warning deserves to be taken seriously. This is now what DC politics looks like in Indiana, and Indiana is not a special case. It is a preview. Voltaire's admiral, the one who was executed to encourage the others, was named John Byng. He was found guilty of failing to do his utmost in battle. Most historians who have looked at the case think he was probably scapegoated, that the failure was at least partly systemic, and that he was made an example of because the British Navy needed to demonstrate consequences. The campaign to remove him was funded, organized, and prosecuted by people with considerably more resources than he had. He was shot on the quarterdeck of his own ship. The practice of shooting admirals was discontinued shortly afterward. Whether the lesson was that it worked or that it had stopped working depends on who you ask. I am Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines, analysis from the edge. If you think this kind of analysis is worth having, subscribe now. The most instructive episodes tend to be the ones nobody is describing clearly.